Jose Lugo Cruet began his wage and hour career as an investigator in the Houston District Office in January of 2009. During his tenure with the Wage and Hour Division, Jose has served as an instructor for various national office courses offered for newly hired investigators, as well as providing training to delegates of the countries of Paraguay and Qatar. A U.S. Air Force veteran, Jose earned a Bachelor of Science and Technology degree in Civil Technology and Construction Management from the University of Houston. After completing his undergraduate degree, Jose went on to work in the private sector as a field engineer before entering public service at the Social Security Administration in 2002. Later, while continuing to work full-time, Jose earned a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Phoenix. Nora McKenna began her federal service career as a wage and hour investigator with the Department of Labor in July of 2020. Nora was born and raised on Long Island in New York. She went to college at the State University of New York at Geneseo, earning an undergraduate degree in International Affairs and Urban Geography. She moved to Texas last year to begin working with the Department of Labor. Previously, Nora served with the Peace Corps in Western China, where she taught English at an underfunded university and conducted leadership conferences and cultural events, helping Chinese students become more connected with American customs. Nora continues to devote her time to public service, where she has the pleasure of connecting with many workers and employers across a multitude of industries in her role in the Houston District Office of the Department of Labor. Jose, you can begin sharing your screen now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Joe, for the opportunity to present and share, talk to you guys a little bit about the laws that we enforce. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So bear with me 1 second. Okay. So the agency we're with, we are part of the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division specifically. Our agency is one of 25 different agencies under the department's umbrella. Our agency is particularly responsible for the enforcement of various labor laws that have to do primarily with wages and hours of work. Most commonly, the law that I'm going to be discussing today is the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this is the law that has to do with the basic federal guidelines for minimum wage, the overtime requirements, child labor regulations, and the record keeping requirements. Now, additionally, in addition to this law, we do enforce a number of other laws in our agency. Commonly, one of the other most common laws that we enforce is the Family Medical Leave Act. Additionally, we do enforce H-1B provisions, labor provisions, H-2B employment labor provisions as well, CCPA, government contracts, and so forth. Now, because of time limitations, I'm going to be just primarily focusing my time on the Fair Labor Standards Act. So our agency enforces, first and foremost, the laws as they stand today. So while we would love to talk about the proposed changes on minimum wage, we are not allowed to do so. I apologize for that in advance. As it pertains to this law, there are some basic provisions of the law. These are the major provisions of the law. Coverage. There is a standard used to determine when an employer is covered, and the federal standards are applicable. That would be where either minimum wage and or overtime and or child labor requirements are going to be applicable to an employer. For the purposes of this presentation and because of time, I will not go into detail on it, but just to give you an idea, the vast majority of employers are covered under the provisions of the federal law. And additionally, there are state requirements that could be in addition to or separate from the federal guidelines. So we don't enforce those, and unfortunately, I cannot discuss those. We are in the state of Texas, which is usually similar to the federal guidelines nonetheless.
Jose, we can't see your screen.
Okay.
Make sure you're sharing to desktop or something.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, can y'all see it now?
Yes, you're good now.
Okay, sorry about that. Um, okay, so the first part of the regulation, one of the common issues that we do find in our law, in the Fair Labor Standards Act, is an employment relationship. Um, that is where employees are incorrectly classified as independent contractors. So that is a very common issue that we find. And our agency uses an economic reality test that has been historically utilized for years by the U.S. Supreme Court in assessing the economic reality of a situation. So I'm not going into detail on this, but unfortunately, it is the most common thing to think about. This is going to be that when the employee is economically dependent on you as an employer, they're going to be commonly classified as an employee and not an independent contractor. So if they're not in business for themselves, they're not independent, they don't have the financial independence from your business, then you must classify them for our purposes as employees. And then obviously then you would actually have to abide by the requirements of the FLSA as it pertains to minimum wage, overtime records that you have to maintain, and child labor regulations. Notice that I'm not talking about taxes or things of that nature because we don't enforce any of that part. All right, the current minimum wage at a federal level is $7.25. So while there are things out there in the news and the media that talk about potential raises and things like that, we just enforce the law as it stands. So $7.25 is the current minimum wage. So any employee that's covered under this law that's non-exempt from the minimum wage requirements must be paid this amount of money. The payments must be in cash or an equivalent. So the law does allow for considerations of things like lodging facilities, meals, to be counted as wages under Section 203M of the Act. Nonetheless, when they are considered as wages for purposes of minimum wage, they can also be counted as wages for purposes of overtime provisions. And it can get a little more complicated, but for the most part, just the most common scenario we see is payment of wages in the form of check or cash. You have to pay at least $7.25 per hour. You can obviously pay more, but this is the minimum requirement. Deductions is another issue that we do encounter from time to time. So deductions that are obviously commonly allowed is going to be what's federally required, taxes and benefits and things of that nature. Deductions that are considered to be illegal is anything that breaks into, takes away from their minimum wage or overtime payments that are not your typical deductions, such as damages, tools, cash register shortages, things like that, that you wouldn't typically be expected as an employee to be having to pay, that are supposed to be the responsibility of the business. It's basically a business expense, not an employee requirement. So the law does further define hours of work. It actually goes into delineating what is going to be hours of work based on the premise of suffered or permitted work. So when an employee is permitted to do work, you must pay that time. And when the employee suffered the work, even if it was not permitted, you must also pay that time. So situations we do encounter from time to time with regards to this requirements are going to be when a travel time, on-call time. I don't think you guys are going to encounter sleep arrangements, but training often is questioned as to, is it going to be hours of work or not? So there are specific guidelines. There are fact sheets that our agency has and can provide. Additionally, we as investigators can provide technical assistance, not legal advice though, as it pertains to helping understand if the things they're doing are correct or not. Another problem area we do encounter from time to time is going to be with regards to rest and meal periods. So a typical meal break is expected to be 30 minutes or more. So a problem we do encounter from time to time is when employees are cut their meal break in half, or they're asked to conduct work while they're actually on break. So when the employee is not allowed to actually get a full 30-minute meal break, then technically it's going to be an issue because those hours need to be compensated. When we're talking about short rest breaks, 20 minutes or less, so the rest breaks, most commonly, the most common comparison is smokers. Occasionally, companies do allow for smoke breaks. And if you do provide additional breaks of 20 minutes or more during the course of a day, those breaks can be deducted. But short breaks of 15 minutes that are often allocated to increase productivity in a business, those actually need to be compensated. So what is overtime? So overtime, it's the simple understanding of it is going to be the minimum requirement is going to be time and a half of the regular rate. So the regular rate is actually an hourly amount, but allocates for all the pay that the employee received that's non-discretionary. And it's divided by all the hours that the employee worked in the week. So for instance, if you pay an employee an hourly rate and you pay that employee a bonus, a production bonus, then the rate of pay increases, causing the actual overtime rate to actually go up as well. So those are things to take into account. So the most common scenario we do see obviously is payment of overtime is just based on an hourly rate. Now, overtime, just the fact that you pay someone on a salary basis does not mean that you don't have to meet the requirements of having to pay time and a half. If the employee is not particularly exempt from the overtime provisions under any particular exemption, then you must pay overtime at time and a half. There are other states that may actually require double time. Our law just allows for, or requires rather, time and a half. When you do pay in addition to the time and a half, you pay extra in increments of usually half hour extra or halftime extra, such as the case in California. The law does allow you to obtain credit to satisfy additional overtime requirements when you pay double time for hours that you must then pay at time and a half. And it can get a little complicated as it pertains to that, but unfortunately, don't have the time to go into that. But if you do need additional assistance with that, you can always reach out to us. Now, one of the common problems we encounter as it pertains to overtime is that employers don't understand that a work week standard, what it means. So employers may pay on a bi-weekly basis, a semi-monthly basis, a weekly basis, whatever other basis they want. There's no specific requirement. Usually the law just requires at least semi-monthly pay for non-exempt employees, unless if you're in the government sector. So the law does require that as it pertains to time, the hours of work, you do account and keep track of them on a week-to-week basis, a 7-day period. That week-to-week basis should not change. It's typically just a window of time that you will use to determine when the person reached and exceeded 40 hours. So a problem we do encounter here is occasionally companies will utilize a biweekly standard of 80 hours. Some industries are allowed, healthcare as an example, but not necessarily the industry you guys are in. Additionally, another problem we do encounter with regards to that is a semi-monthly payment, where employees are often confused and don't understand the concept of a work week basis as it pertains to a semi-monthly basis and get really confused with that. So the work week, the documentation of hours that the employee worked is on a 7-day basis, not unless exempted from overtime. So the regular rate, as I explained earlier, is just total compensation divided by total of hours of work. So that is irrelevant of how you determine the compensation method. So whether you pay the person on a commission basis, whether you pay the person bonuses, whether you pay the person on a piece rate, on a salary basis, if you're not, if your employee is non-exempt, then you must do this formula. And obviously that's the reason for accounting for the hours on a week-to-week basis, because you need that information to be able to do this math. So here's some exclusions of the regular rate. Obviously gifts, Christmas gifts, for example, payments that you don't have to account for hours that are not considered hours of work, expenses, profit sharing plans, and so forth. Now, as with everything, there are exemptions to the requirements, and there are overtime exemptions. The most common ones are the white collar or 541 exemptions. We also refer to them as 13A1 because they're found on Section 213A1 of the Act. These are going to be, generally speaking, your professionals, your executives, your supervisors, and so forth of a business. So there's 3 tests, 3 common tests of these individuals, these employees: a salary basis test, a salary level, and a job duties requirement. So the salary level actually recently was increased. It went up from 455 to 684. So the current standard is this. This is the full salary amount required per week. You can obviously pay them more, but when your guarantee amount has to be 90% of this amount. You can actually account for 10% for bonuses that are non-discretionary, but in general, in a whole week, they must receive at least 684. You can obviously pay them more than that, and they must be paid on a guarantee basis of, generally speaking, about 616 per week plus bonuses. Or if you have a guarantee of, for example, $700, then you meet that requirement. So the salary basis means that your payment has to be generally guaranteed. You cannot make deductions for example, working 38 hours. You still have to pay the full guarantee salary. There are certain exceptions to that requirement, but they're not very common. They're for situations like being out on jury duty, FMLA leave, safety infractions when the company has policies of that nature. And these are the specific ones that I was talking about. Again, they're not very common to see this. Most situations is that you pay the full salary. The salary should not be attributed to a performance requirement on an hours requirement. It should be attributed to the employee go to work during the week, and you must pay that employee that guarantee salary. So in addition to the requirement of paying them on a guarantee basis and paying them at least $684 in a week or more, then you must also, your employees must meet certain duty tests or pass certain duty tests. The 3 most common ones are executive duties. This is usually going to be somebody that directs the work of 2 or more employees. Usually like a supervisor is usually what's really attributed to this type of exemption. There is administrative exemption as well. This is not an administrative employee that's doing a clerical type work. This is rather a person with a lot of discretion and independent judgment in the company, such as an administrator of a company, CFO. It can be sometimes estimators of a business and things like that. These are common type of examples of employees that do meet, that often do meet the requirements of a duty test. Now, understand that the duties are specific to an individual employee. So just the fact that you have a title of engineer doesn't mean that you're automatically exempt because of that title. So additionally, there's a professional's duties. This would be your 4-year degree employees, employees that have actually acquired a bachelor's degree or higher level education, and are working in their field. An accountant, for example, would be somebody that meets this criteria, an engineer. So these employees, these 3 requirements is what's required to actually have an employee correctly classified as salaried exempt. So here's some common areas, some common problems that we see. And when an employee is paid multiple rates, you must either identify the rate that they're being paid when the overtime is paid, or you must actually combine the rates and do a weighted average method. There's tipped employees. These are usually your restaurant top employees or service employees that do get paid a cash wage plus the tips are counted as part of their wages. Not something that I would expect to see in your type of industry. Another type of problem we see is misclassification of the exemptions, misclassification of employees as independent contractors, the hours work issue where they're not properly accounting for all hours work, improper deductions, things of that nature. Those are some of the common issues we do see. All right, so I'll turn it over to Nora here.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about youth employment and record keeping as like the other areas of the FLSA that we enforce. So youth employment, this is, anyone who's under 18, there are certain rules that apply to them. So federal youth employment, they have set hours for people mainly who are 14 and 15 and 16 are working. Okay. So Jose, you can control it. So you can just hit as I'm done.
Okay.
Okay, so anyone who's under 14, typically, they're not going to be working in certain establishments if they're not with, with their parents. Someone who's 14 and 15, this would usually be 3 hours on school days and 23 hours in a school week. These are typically, in restaurant or quick service jobs. 16 and 17, they can work unlimited hours. So with youth employment, we mainly look at hazardous occupations. So things like if, say, for example, someone was working in a bakery, they could be a cashier if they're 14 and 15, but they can't be operating those heavy mixers or using, the big like bakery grade ovens. So they can handle handheld like kitchen appliances, but they cannot handle the more hazardous appliances. And same with people like, if they're doing roofing or something that's more dangerous. So there are 17 of those and you can look at them online for more details. So record keeping is where I think that we really need to just focus on because there are a lot of errors that happen with record keeping. Time clocks are something that, they're not required, but that does not mean that time records are not required. So time clocks are, the most common way that people can keep track of their time records. If there are not accurate time records, what we would do is we would, have to rely on interviews. And if, their hours are off, the employee might be getting more back wages if those time records are not kept accurately. So what we recommend, is just making sure that you have like the clock in, clock out time. If you can keep that, that would be something that it would be easier for us to see, and you would definitely be in compliance in that way. So these are basic records that every employer is expected to have for their non-exempt employees. So if someone, you'd have to have their name, their sex, their date of birth, what their rate of pay is, their total hours worked, total daily or weekly straight time earnings, and total overtime compensation, and deductions. So the deductions that we would really be looking at would be, if there were a uniform deduction or something like that, that's what we would have to look at. General, tax deductions, that isn't something that we would really be paying attention to. So it's more like, if the employer made any deductions for the employee. Posting. So we want the employer to see, the employees to see like what the FLSA is, because they need to know the entitlement of their rights. So what we enforce is we should have a poster. Every facility should have a poster where the employees are entering. So it's common that people maybe don't have this. And if you wanted to reach out to us, we can easily provide you a poster, but this is a requirement from the FLSA.
Yeah, and the posters we do provide are free. They're easy to print from our website. But yeah, you must post it in as it says, a conspicuous place where employees can see it.
Okay, so with the FLSA enforcement, a common thing that people come and like they complain to us about is my employer isn't giving me my vacation days or something like that. So if the vacation is something that we don't look at. We don't look at vacation. We don't look at holidays. The easiest way to remember it for us is that we only focus on hours worked. So the only hours that the employee was physically working, that is what we will. So if there's anything that they're not working, they have sick days, PTO, vacation, we're not going to pay attention to that. So we would never enforce it. If there's pay raises, we're not concerned either. We are concerned with the minimum wage. What we also enforce is if it's over overtime. So if there is hours worked over 40 in the week, we will enforce the full rate of pay. But if an employee says, my employer promised me $18 an hour, but I'm getting paid 16, we don't pay attention to that. We look at the records, it's very black and white. So we wouldn't really take that into interpretation. So what the FLSA enforcement looks like, I'm sure that you guys are wondering, like, what would an investigation or a compliance review look like if we came in? So when we come in, we would, we would start with getting the records. We would want to get the records from the employer. That would look like it would be 2 years. So for the past 2 years, we look at the records. Then we would conduct employee interviews. And what the interviews are, it's a confidential process. We want to verify what the records say. So if the records say that, they work 10 hours, but then 10 hours in the week, but the employee is saying that, no, actually I worked 15 every time my employer was deducting hours, then we would have to take a sample of interviews and see what is the truth. So that's why the time records are really important, because if we do see that like they match up, then there's no refuting it, right? But if there aren't time records, we might have to go based on the interviews, and it would be a little bit more of a complicated process. And then in the end of this, we would have a schedule a final conference, go over what the back wages or violations are with the employer. And, our goal is to make sure everyone's in compliance. We don't go out thinking that this is all malicious. Like this is kind of an education process, because a lot of people don't know who we are. And a lot of people, when they encounter us, it's their first time ever encountering us. So we want to make sure that everyone is just educated, and our job is just to ensure future compliance. So I just went over this with, it's 2 years. So if there's been violations for 18 years, we only go back to the last 2. And we would calculate the back wages accordingly. So we want to make sure that there is an agreement obtained. And, if there isn't, say someone did complain, we didn't find a violation, we would just tell them their 16B rights, which is their rights to private action. Okay, the penalties. So Jose, can you actually talk about this a little bit?
Sure. So as it pertains to penalties, essentially, if penalties for us is going to be just a that is imposed on an employer for violating the rules again. So if we conduct a second investigation and you're still in violation of not payment of minimum wage or not payment of overtime, then you can expect to receive a penalty. Additionally, the penalties do go up based on how many times you've been investigated and so forth. Forced child labor violations, we do take those a lot more seriously. So if there are violations of the child labor provisions, you can usually expect to receive a penalty. The higher the violation or the threshold of violation, the more severe the penalty is. So as an example, if a child is injured and in the course of their job duties, the penalties can sometimes exceed $100,000 if the injury was serious enough. So that's why we say child labor is very restrictive, is very important to consider, and we take that very seriously. There are different kind of criterias for agricultural restrictions. Usually the provisions there are 16 and under, or rather under 16 rather than under 18. So the rules are very different in the agricultural arena. We're more than welcome to discuss that on a more on one-on-one basis at a later time.
Okay, so, this is what we have available to everyone online. So the handy reference guide, that is kind of like our overview of what, what we do. Fact sheets are, if you were confused about anything that we said and you wanted to look up minimum wage fact sheet, this will give you a bulleted kind of just very simplistically language on what everything that we enforce. So you can look up all of this on our website. And yeah, so if you want to file a complaint, or you have people who know you want to file a complaint, we have a general line. And this is where, we would kind of listen to it, screen the complaint, and see if it's something that we would take and handle. And yeah, so we have offices all over the country. We're contacting you guys. We are talking to you from the Houston office.
Additionally, if you do have questions, we do provide technical assistance as well to employers. So if you have technical questions, as I expressed earlier, you can reach out to us. I'll provide you here. I will provide you my direct work cell phone number and my office number. I'm in Houston, so my office number is going to be 281-280-7144 is my office number. Again, 281-280-7144. My cell is going to be 832-703-4918. 832-703-4918. So we're always available to answer technical questions, provide assistance to employers that obviously are just looking for staying in compliance and had questions about our law specifically. Any questions?
Thank you, Jose and Nora. We are on a bit of a time crunch, but we will gladly pass along your contact information to our members if they have any questions or need any assistance. We thank you for coming on today, and have a great day.
Thank you, guys.